Welcome to tonight's class on the Gospels. We're still in the Gospel of Matthew, and tonight we're going to be looking at chapters 18 through 23. And this is the outline that deals with the transition of Jesus' ministry from Galilee to Jerusalem. And all these passages, this is Jesus is turning his face to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Matthew. Here's an outline for the whole lecture tonight. We'll look at four parts of this larger section. Matthew 18, 1 through 35 is Jesus' fourth extended sermon. At this point, we have looked at, read through, analyzed the first three sermons, which was the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Jesus' sermon about missionary activity in chapter 10. And last week we talked about Matthew chapter 13, this middle sermon. And tonight, this fourth extended sermon, we'll spend some time with that, looking at Jesus' statements here and what that has to do with the Matthew's community in Antioch. After that fourth extended sermon, we'll look at Matthew 19, 1 through 2016, this transition of leaving Galilee. And before he goes to Jerusalem proper, he goes into Judea. We'll look at some passages there that are that I'll highlight. And then this last section in 20:17 through 34, this is him going up to Jerusalem. Now, the New Testament says go up to Jerusalem all the time, and it's mainly because Jerusalem is on a mountain, and it's about 3,000 feet high. So every approach to Jerusalem is going uphill. So it is literally a city on a hill. And so all the biblical passages that talk about going to Jerusalem, whether they're going south to Jerusalem, north, east, west to Jerusalem, they're all going up to Jerusalem. And the final section, Matthew 21, 1 through 23, 39, is Jesus actually entering into Jerusalem and some of the events that surround his entering in Jerusalem. And so we'll spend some time dealing with that at the end. So here at Matthew 18, in this sermon, it starts off with this question: who is the greatest in the empire of heaven? We've been talking about the empire of heaven rather than the kingdom of heaven throughout this class to pay attention to how political this concept is. Rather than the kingdom of heaven, empire of heaven really shows how anti-Roman this concept is. And the word for empire is the same word for kingdom. And any Roman or Greek who heard this terminology, kingdom of heaven, would have absolutely associated it with a political understanding of that concept, kingdom of God. So that's why I keep saying empire of God. There you see an ancient painting or mosaic depicting this scene, who is the greatest. Of course, this is where Jesus makes reference to children. Whoever is going to be greatest in my kingdom must become like one of these children. So this insistence on humility is the beginning of Jesus' fourth major sermon. So here is that sermon in outline. The whole thing, 1 through 35, represents Jesus' fourth sermon in Matthew's Gospel, of course. But it's also divided into 5 sections. The first section, 1 through 5, verses 1 through 5, deals with the greatest in the empire. The second section, 6 through 9, deals with stumbling blocks. The middle section, 10 through 14, is the parable of the lost sheep. 15 through 22 probably are some of the most important verses in this sermon because it deals specifically with resolving community conflict, which was a major issue in Matthew's community. So this prescription that Jesus gives on how to deal with community conflict is exactly how Matthew understands his community and the way his community should deal with conflict, knowing that it was a community in conflict. And then he ends with this parable that follows that section real closely, dealing with the parable of the unforgiving servant. So verse 22 deals specifically with forgiving, and then Jesus tells this story about unforgiving and what that's like. So go ahead and pause this video right now and read through this section of Matthew, and really kind of highlight some of the most important passages in each one of those sections. So go ahead and pause and read that, and then once you've finished reading Matthew, come back. All right, I hope you've read through Matthew chapter 18 to see how this sermon's broken up with Matthew. In here, I just want to kind of go in a little bit more detail. The whole sermon is an internal message. So this sermon does not address outsiders. If you remember the missionary sermon in chapter 10 had everything to do with how the disciples were supposed to spread the gospel and relate to insiders and outsiders. Jesus says, I was only called to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that deals specifically with how you reach out. This sermon deals with community ethics. So the whole sermon is an internal message for Matthew's community in Antioch. And it deals specifically with how the community stays together. At every section, and I basically, in the bullets that follow, are the outline of the sermon again. But at the very beginning, when he talks about becoming like a child, greatness there is measured by humility. So he begins this sermon with this story about being humble like a child, and that becomes the community ethic. For the community to stay together, it has to be humble. There can't be any haughty voices that continue to break it up. That second section, verses 6 through 9, it deals with stumbling blocks. And there it's this very harsh critique of being a stumbling block to others in the community. In other words, don't be a trouble to someone else. Don't cause someone else to lose faith. So you're not supposed to do that to others. And in fact, if you do that to somebody else, Jesus says it's better for you to tie a millstone around your neck and throw yourself into the sea. It's better to be dead than to cause somebody to stumble. And so that deals with how one is supposed to interact with the community in positive ways. The other one, at the second part of this verse, it basically says to remove trouble from your own life. So not only is an individual in Matthew's community not supposed to cause somebody else to stumble, anything in their own lives that causes them to stumble, they should take out. So you have this pretty graphic passage about if your eye causes you to stumble, then pluck it out. It's better to go into the afterlife maimed than to be cast into the fiery pits whole. So it's a very intense passage there, but it deals with this concept of stumbling block. And Matthew has Jesus preaching this sermon for sure, but this sermon has everything to do with Matthew's community and his context in Antioch. So he moves from that to dealing with how to kind of take care of community conflict. So there's this prescription there. Seek the estranged community member. And this whole section is, if you go back and look at here, you got the parable of the lost sheep. So those who have been in the community and have wandered away, and you wonder how much this stumbling block part is related to it. The idea is that if there are some who have left the community, that person who's left is still important to God. So it is incumbent upon all members to gather together and reach out to this person and bring him or her back into the community. And then, which leads directly into how to resolve community conflict. And so this idea that you're supposed to go to the individual And then if there's not resolved, you have to bring a couple of other people. And then if it's not resolved, there's this whole process that either leads to reconciliation or removal, right? And at the end of it, it's this penchant for forgiveness, that no matter what, you should forgive, which then leads into that last section, which deals specifically with forgiving people because you've been forgiving. And this parable of the unforgiving servant, where one person is in need and is scared that they're going to have all their possessions confiscated, but then finds complete forgiveness by the one who they have owed debt to. And once they've been let off the hook, then they force somebody else who owes them money to pay it back 100-fold. So it's this terrible story about an unforgiving servant. And there's the story is, don't be that way. So this is how Jesus' fourth sermon functions as internal community ethic. It has everything to do with how to live together in harmony, how not to cause trouble, how to resolve trouble, how to reach out with to those who have already left, with this insistence on forgiveness. So it's really one of the strongest sermons in the five that Jesus gives for an internal community ethic. So I hope you read that and saw that it's not just Jesus' sermon to the people in his own time, but this is actually Matthew's sermon to the people in his community. All right, we'll move on to chapter 14. Chapter 18, he begins this sermon with this story about being humble as a child. He revisits that theme. Matthew has Jesus revisit that theme in chapter 19, verse 14. Let the children come to me and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the empire of heaven belongs. Again, I want to emphasize how political that is. And the idea that children somehow maintain high priority would have been fairly remarkable in the Greco-Roman world. In this culture, you ruled, and your capacity to rule and rule ruthlessly was seen as the favor of the gods. So if you're in charge, it's completely understood that God has put you in that place and that you've been blessed to do that. The ethics of the Jesus movement seem to contradict that, specifically with this concept of children, and that the lowly people are the ones who inherit things first, which is kind of the first word of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the empire of heaven. And here again, you get this theme that children are ones who are really made for this counter empire to Rome. So it's a pretty revolutionary thought in that regard. So let's look at this section a little bit better. Verse 19, 1 through 2, really sets the stage. This is the beginning of Jesus' journey to his crucifixion in Jerusalem. So Matthew pays very close attention when he's writing here. It's a major turning point in Matthew's gospel. So Jesus delivers this sermon in chapter 18, and immediately after delivering that sermon, he is moving towards Jerusalem. So the next thing we'll encounter is him going into Jerusalem and preaching his last sermon. So I want you to take some time out, read Matthew 19, 3 through 12, and answer this question. It's a section dealing with divorce. So whatever your concepts are about divorce, this doesn't have anything to do with that. But I do want you to read this section and just answer this question. What does this section, Matthew chapter 19, 3 through 12, say about divorce? So go ahead and pause the video right now, read that passage, and answer that question. What does this section say about divorce? So go ahead and pause it and then read it and come back. All right, welcome back. I hope you learned a little bit about that section. It's a pretty harsh section, and for anybody in modern America, it might be a little hard to swallow. But I wanted you to read that passage in Matthew and then turn to this section in Saldarini. Now, you can go to our e-learning site and pull up these pages from Saldarini's book. And I want you to read this section of chapter, pages 147 through 151, and then answer this question: what does Saldarini say about what this passage meant to Matthew's community? So now we're going to have another reading exercise. So go ahead and pause it, go to e-learning site, open up this section for Saldarini, and read these 5 pages. All right. I hope you were able to get through that quickly. I don't think that section of Saldarini was hard to read, but you can see there how Saldarini interprets this section on divorce in chapter 19, 3 through 12. See, Saldarini doesn't see it as a prohibition against divorce for all time. Saldarini reads that passage about divorce as something that's important for Matthew's community. This community that was already on the rocks, this super minority, a minority in a minority group, divorce would have just been devastating for this small community. So the prohibition against divorce is pretty staunch in this saying of Jesus. But it's not just the saying of Jesus. It's just like Jesus, all these sermons. It's not just what Jesus is saying to his followers. This is as important, if not more important, for Matthew to say to his community, because he doesn't want his community to break up. So these prohibitions against divorce here in chapter 19 and the prohibition against divorce in the first sermon of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount function as internal critique. He wants Matthew wants his community to stay together, and he feels like divorce is a way that would jeopardize that unity. So you get that strong prohibition. So let's now move to this next section. In Matthew 20:21, these are the mother of the sons of Zebedee, this quote here. This is James and John, the son of Zebedee. This is what their mom asks Jesus. Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit, one at your right and one at your left, in your empire. So it's a pretty intense question she has for Jesus, or maybe not a question, but an all-out request that her sons would have special privilege. But this is right in that section where Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. Immediately before entering Jerusalem, Jesus does 3 things. He predicts his death in chapter 20, verses 17 through 19. He deals with internal arguments with the disciples, and this has to do with these guys' mother asking him about their place in his kingdom, and he basically asks them if they're ready for it, and they said yes, and then he says no, nobody really is. And then that last section, Jesus heals these 2 blind men, which is a little bit different in some of the other synoptic versions of this story. But for our purposes tonight, I want you to again pause this video and then go to Matthew 20. Read this section, 17 through 19, 20 through 28, and 29 through 34, and just highlight the major themes in these different sections, and then come back to the video and we'll continue the lecture. All right, welcome back. So I wanted you to read this and have this on your mind when I start talking about chapter 20, verses 17 through 34. Here we see a progression from Jesus. It's a progression from Jesus, him predicting his death. So it starts with him, and then it goes out to his disciples, the closest people, dealing with their own internal conflicts. And then it moves to the outsiders, others outside his small group. And so there's this progression from Jesus himself to the disciples to others. Now the question is, how does this movement from kind of internal to external address how Matthew's community in Antioch should relate internally and externally? How are they supposed to treat each other? How are they supposed to understand the nature of their community? How are they then, how do they work out from that in interacting with the rest of the world? Should they be accommodating to the world, or not accommodating. And I think what you see here, this Jesus predicting his death, this is a common theme throughout Matthew, where Jesus calls his followers to be humble, to be self-sacrificial throughout. And then you get for this prediction of death followed immediately by his disciples' mom asking if they can have a special place in the afterlife, what it looks like. Maybe not the afterlife. Maybe they understood that Jesus was going to somehow overthrow the Roman Empire and lead Israel into this state of independence over against the Roman Empire. That is a legitimate understanding here. And so she's asking if her sons would have a special place in Jesus' empire once he instituted it. So whether it's in the afterlife or in the here and now, it's still kind of internal politics. How do you deal with internal stuff in the community? Followed by this section on him healing two blind men. Now, this is real interesting because the disciples and others don't want him to deal with these blind men. But Jesus doesn't listen to them and goes ahead and heals them. So there is a reluctance in Matthew to deal with the outside, but Jesus does every time. So it's clear that the community should understand itself as servants and self-sacrifice. And then internally there's conflicts with the disciples that's indicative of an internal conflict with Matthew's community. But in spite of that, Matthew's community is still supposed to reach out to those outside and take care of them. So that's how this movement in this last, second to last section of this passage kind of relates to the community that Matthew's writing his gospel to. And then this passage comes after Jesus has actually entered into Jerusalem, Matthew 22:21. Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God. Now this is a famous statement of Jesus's, and it is against the religious leaders in Jerusalem who are trying to catch Jesus in something seditious so that they can bring up charges against him. And so they brought him a coin that would have looked a lot like this. Now this is Augustus Caesar, who was the first Caesar in the new Roman Empire when the empire moved from a republic to an authentic empire. Augustus was the main guy, or the first one after Julius Caesar. So here you have a coin with Augustus Caesar's face right on the front of it. And when the Pharisees were trying to entrap Jesus and make him say something seditious like, you shouldn't give any money to Rome, you shouldn't pay taxes and tribute to Rome, Jesus says this instead. He says, whose image is on this coin? And they said, well, it's Caesar's image. And he says, well, give to the emperor, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. In other words, this money doesn't reflect God. So it is inconsequential to life. So Jesus really did stump them, according to Matthew, for sure. So Jesus is entering into Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. He comes in what is something like a parade. Everybody's excited about it. And they lay down palm branches. It's called Palm Sunday when churches celebrate this event. But as soon as Jesus enters into Jerusalem to all this pomp and fanfare, as soon as the parade is over, he begins to critique and argue with the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And this depiction here is him turning over the tables at the temple. Now, this is all the reason that the religious leaders need to bring up charges against Jesus. And he drives people out of the temple and causes all this chaos in what is already a festival season of Passover. There would have been 4 times as many people in Jerusalem for this pilgrimage feast where everybody's coming to Jerusalem to observe this religious holiday, and he drives people out of the temple. This act in and of itself would have been a seditious movement because it's breaking the peace, and the Roman government at the time would have looked really, this would have been really bad in their eyes. So this was, when he came into the parade and then drove what he calls the money lenders out of the temple, this would have certainly given rise to an attempt to take his life on the part of anybody who wants to keep peace in Jerusalem. So what I need you to do now is take Saldarini. Again, this section is uploaded to our e-learning site for right now. Read pages 52 through 67 and read how Saldarini interprets Jesus' conflict with the religious leaders. And then see how Saldarini determines how this helps Matthew's community in Antioch. So go ahead and pause the video again and read that section of Saldarini and see how he interprets these events. All right, welcome back. Again, we're still in Matthew 22. Now, I need you to read Matthew 22, 15 through 22. It's very quick. What does this mean for Matthew's community in Antioch regarding taxes? This deals specifically with the coin issue about Roman taxes and whatnot. So go ahead and read Matthew 22, 15 through 22, and then read Saldarini pages 141 through 147, and see how he interprets the issues of taxes found in Matthew. So go ahead and do both of those together. That's not a lot of pages in Saldarini, and this little section in Matthew won't take you very long at all. But you'll see. Ask yourself the question, like, what does this look like for Matthew's community who's in Antioch, the capital of the Roman province of Syria, who all have to pay taxes to Caesar and give tribute to Caesar, and then read how Saldarini interprets that. So go ahead and do that. Welcome back. Again, I hope that was a helpful exercise to see how Saldarini interprets the tax paying. I want to leave you with this image. It's a great image from a Syriac translation of the Bible. This is the language of Syriac. It goes from right to left, and that it is actually, you'd have to turn it on its side to read it. But this is a painting in one of these ancient Bibles of Jesus riding in on a donkey, followed by his disciples, and all of the people in Jerusalem laying down palm branches for him as a parade. Now, over here it has the religious leaders looking on, not very pleased with it. You have a guy climbing the tree. It's a really interesting depiction of this passage, and for so many of their in this early Jesus movement, in antiquity in general, literacy was so low. So even in some of the Bibles that were written, they would have these pretty clear pictures of some of these Bible scenes, so that all those who couldn't read the text could actually look through the book and see the pictures that depict it. So that's the lecture for tonight. If you guys have any questions, please just send me an email. I'll respond to you as quick as I can. But that's our section on Matthew 28 through 23, where Jesus preaches his fourth, second to last sermon as he transitions towards Jerusalem, which will eventually lead to his crucifixion. Hope tonight's lecture was interesting for you. Hope the readings were real helpful. And again, if you need anything, just give me a call.